I'm Mike Vardy.
Meal planning is important because it prevents us from being a disappointed wreck when dinner time comes around and we have no clue what to make, or even if we have the ingredients to make the meal. It's a time and a money saver, but most importantly, it frees up valuable brain space. Creating a meal plan prepares us for the week to come and gives us peace of mind that we're organized and can feed ourselves and our family. That's why I do it, and that's why Plan to Eat helps me do it. Your subscription includes access to the Plan to Eat website and fully featured mobile apps on iOS and Android. And Plan to Eat gives you the tools to clip and organize recipes from any website, the ones your family loves and that fit your dietary preferences and needs. And you can create a meal plan around your schedule. Then what happens is the Plan to Eat software automatically creates an organized shopping list based on your plan. So sign up for your free trial at plantoeat.com/timecrafting. That's plantoeat.com/timecrafting. The coupon will be automatically applied to your account and can be used when you're ready to subscribe. It's valid for new customers only. Give Plan to Eat a try today.
And this is the Productivityist Podcast. On this week's episode of the Productivityist Podcast, I talk with Gregg Krech. Gregg is the founder of an institute that I'm not going to say right now because I talk about it at the beginning of the episode, but we talk about a ton of things. You know, the idea of how Eastern ways are appealing to the West. We talk about a whole bunch of stuff regarding around Eastern Japanese philosophy, how that can apply to productivity. Gregg is one of the leading experts in Japanese psychology in the U.S. He's the author of 5 books, and the one we're going to focus on particularly is called The Art of Taking Action, which is what this episode is titled, Lessons from Japanese Psychology. And it's become an Amazon bestseller, and it offers practical strategies for integrating ideas from Eastern philosophy with contemporary Western living. Let's just dive into this conversation I had with Gregg Krech here on the Productivityist Podcast. Enjoy. I'd like to welcome Gregg Krech to the Productivityist Podcast. Gregg, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Mike.
So when we were going through the introductions for the call, I normally do this with every guest before we start. The first thing I see is I see, you know, and during the research, I see, you know, oh, wow, he's got this thing called the ToDo Institute. Gregg, this is great because Productivityist is all about to do. But then during the conversation, because I always ask, hey, how do we pronounce names and such? Because sometimes I have names that are more challenging to pronounce. And Gregg, you mentioned that it's not actually called the ToDo Institute. It's something, although ToDo is in there. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's mostly called the ToDo Institute, but the actual word as it was designed is a Japanese word, ToDo, and ToDo actually means Eastern way. So it refers to us basing our work kind of on things Japanese and Asian. And then the word todo in Spanish actually means all or everything. But most of the time we actually are called the ToDo Institute in Vermont, where we're based, and in the United States. And that very much relates to the heart of our work in terms of issues about taking action.
So I want to talk about Japanese psychology and the methodology, and because I mean I've spent some time looking at Kanban and Kaizen, and I'm not as deep into it as a lot of other people that I know, but I know a lot of people like to use, you know, Trello is a good example of the Kanban, and you know, we use it in Asana as well when we're doing content flow and things like that. First off, what got you interested in Japanese culture and the philosophy surrounding it, and then how you've bridged it over to the idea of what you do at the Institute?
Well, it's been a long evolution. I actually first got started about exactly 30 years ago, and I was really just in a bookstore and looking at some books, and looked up on the shelf, and there was a book called The Quiet Therapies, which is all about different forms of psychotherapy and psychology in Japan by a man named David Reynolds. And that was kind of my first introduction to any kind of mental health or methods of psychology from Japan. And my initial interest was really very personal. I was in my early 30s, and I was struggling, with my life in certain ways. I was struggling with relationships. I was struggling with getting things done and not getting things done that I should be doing. And I found it tremendously helpful on a personal basis. So I did more reading. I went to some workshops. I ended up getting trained. I never really intended to start an institute and make this my life's work. So I feel more like it discovered me in that sense. But I found that it was a refreshing change from the more traditional kind of Western psychology, Western psychotherapeutic approach that many of us are exposed to. And since I had already been a student of Zen and interested in Asian philosophy, it really resonated with me. So it was a good match for me personally. And ultimately, it allowed me to do this as my work. And I think that I can offer people an alternative to a lot of the kind of traditional approaches to therapy and psychology that they mostly get exposed to in the West.
Now, the ones that you study, now, it's again, pronunciation, Morita therapy, right? Is that
right? So there's three methods that I focus on, particularly in my books. And one of them is Morita therapy, which is has a more action element. It's named after a psychiatrist named Shoma Morita, who lived about 100 years ago or so, and is often considered as rooted in Zen principles or Zen psychology. So that would be one of the three approaches. The second one you actually mentioned, and that's Kaizen. Just a little bit of background on Kaizen. Even though it's got a Japanese name, it was actually developed by an American, Edward Demings, who was sent over to Japan after World War II to help Japan kind of rebuild their industry. And the Kaizen approach is also very oriented towards kind of taking action and what they call incremental improvement. So it's a nice kind of adjunct to Morita therapy, very practical, very concrete. And then the third approach is called Nikon, which means something like inside looking. And that's really the reflective or self-reflective element of Japanese psychology, which has a lot to do with developing healthy relationships with people, with an attitude of appreciation, with cultivating a sense of gratitude for the way that we're supported and just kind of the things that we're given in life. So those three together, I think, are a nice recipe for a delicious cake.
Why do you think people are drawn to the Japanese ways? I mean, I'm seeing more and more people that are kind of like, meditation is an example. I mean, again, that's not exclusively Japanese, but we're seeing a lot more people in the Western world, kind of gravitating towards Eastern, philosophies and methodologies. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it really depends on the person, but I think there's a lot of ancient wisdom that really comes from the East, from China and India and Japan. And you see things like yoga, like traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture. Mm-hmm. And, even 30 years ago when I was starting this work, there was very limited amount of that going on in the United States. And now, acupuncture is reimbursable by insurance.
Yeah, my wife's an acupuncturist, actually. So yes, she studied TCM and she's an acupuncturist. Actually, as we're recording this, she's getting ready to head off to work at practice. So yeah, she's been doing that for almost 20 years, and it's something that I never would have gone to until I met her. And there's definitely some things that it's quite amazing, actually.
It is, and I think acupuncture and Chinese medicine, both of which I have an interest in personally, are good examples of where Western culture has really drawn on and imported these practices and methods and even philosophies from the East. And I think in some cases those things can be integrated. And you see a lot in medicine, for instance, you see the idea of the integration of kind of Eastern and Western medicine. And that's actually even taking place in China. When I was in China about 10 years ago, there were hospitals there that were combining both traditional Chinese medicine and Western medicine. But in some cases, you see that they're really opposing philosophies. And so you see kind of a different philosophical foundation between an Eastern approach and a Western approach. And you see some of that, I think, in terms of the kind of Japanese psychology that we teach. Some of it can be integrated, and some of it is just kind of a different way of understanding and looking at the world and at ourselves.
One of the things that you talk about, and I'm referring to a particular blog post, is you talk about the idea of how Morita therapy can be used as a resource for moving forward when you're kind of facing the period of inaction. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because, you've got the book called The Art of Taking Action, which I definitely want to dive into a little bit as well. But how does most people don't think of that idea of a therapy that necessarily is putting people from inaction to action, especially in terms of like personal productivity. They don't think about like emotional blocks but to actually stave off things like procrastination and stuff. I find that quite fascinating.
Well, I actually think it is fascinating, and one of the things that I find is when I give presentations and do workshops for mental health professionals, the area that is often considered to be the most challenging task for a therapist or a mental health professional, as stated by them, is often getting their clients, getting people to essentially take action. So a lot of these other kinds of issues that come up that have to do with expressing feelings or talking or the kinds of things that you would do in a counseling session are much easier for therapists because they're trained well in that. But when it comes down to it, the way that we make changes in our life is really by doing things and doing things different in many cases. And Morita therapy is a wonderful approach for getting people to move from thinking and talking and deciding to actually taking action in the real world. If you look at the problem of procrastination, people not doing things that they need to be doing. And you say, well, why doesn't a person do something that they need to be doing? And in many cases, the reason is because they don't feel like it. Right? Mm-hmm. So, if you walk into the kitchen and you've got tons of dirty dishes and silverware that's piled above the rim of the sink, you may not feel like doing it. And so many of us put off doing things because we just don't feel like it. And where Morita therapy is a wonderful strategy is that it allows us to make this shift from what I call a feeling-centered approach to life in general, meaning that the measure of whether we do something or don't do it is our feelings, to a more purpose-centered approach to life, which shifts the measure from whether we feel like doing something to whether it's something that needs to be done. So in one case, it's our internal feelings that are guiding us as to whether to take action or not. But as we make that shift, it's the needs of the situation. Do the needs of the situation support my doing those dirty dishes? Do the needs of the situation require me to get my taxes done and filed, right? Do the needs of the situation require me to get out of bed at 3 a.m. and change my infant daughter's dirty diaper? So when we make that shift, we find that we procrastinate a lot less because we still have those feelings of wanting to do something or not wanting to do it. But what we're responding to more often now is whether something needs to be done.
When I was talking to Jon Acuff on a recent episode of the podcast, we talked about, his yard as an example. He wrote the new book, Finish, and he talks about how, the idea of the yard needing to be perfect or needing to be taken care of was something that was weighing on him, but he realized that that's not something that needs to be done at that point. It was the feeling of him having to do it was there, but he realized it wasn't really what was the most important, the most necessary at that time. I think he's straightened his yard out since then, but I think the point there is again, this idea of having that, and you talk about this, the feelings pushing you as opposed to the purpose. And perfectionism is one of the things you touch on too, right? And John touched on it as well, is that the reason we don't finish is because one of the reasons that we're afraid of, like, say, finishing, or one of the reasons that we don't start is because perfectionism comes into play. What in your book, you talk about like how perfectionism can get in the way. What are your thoughts on that, and how does again, this idea of Japanese psychology and what it can teach you push you away from this idea of perfectionism and help you overcome it?
Well, I think that there's a couple of different things. One comment I wanted to make about that whole idea of perfectionism is I'm a writer, and I was listening to a recorded talk by the now deceased author Peter Matheson, who wrote the book The Snow Leopard. He was a National Book Award winner. And in his talk, he says that for a writer, in reality, a book is never actually finished. It's simply abandoned.
Yep. I've heard that quote before, and it's true. As I'm a writer too, and exactly, it's like,
Because we always want to make it better, right?
Yeah.
And there is always something we can make better. And it's one of the great things about working with a deadline, whether it's a real deadline, for example, from a publisher, or a self-imposed deadline, because you have to just stop because it's time to stop. And so it's a great example, I think, where if part of the needs of the situation are that we have to have something completed or done at a particular time, then we work with that need, even though our feelings and thoughts may be saying, this isn't really ready, and I know that if I had one more day, I could improve this. And so if we can work with shift to a more purpose-centered view of things, then it's much easier for us to kind of just stop and not allow our feelings of being concerned or worried, or this isn't really good enough, to kind of dictate our action, which in many cases ends up meaning that we're late or significantly late with something. So the other side of this is that that has to do with perfectionism, is that perfectionism really is is grounded in grandiosity. In other words, it's grounded in the idea that I really have a very high view of myself, to think that I can write a book that would be somehow perfect or great even. And so there's a humility that comes very naturally with Japanese psychology. And humility isn't something that's often considered tremendously valuable in terms of our Western cultural view of things. But in Asia, humility is a very important quality, and something that I think can be cultivated in a realistic way. And if we work from a humble standpoint, then we don't expect to create something perfect, right? Because if we really are recognizing our limitations and our weaknesses, for example, we do the best we can, and that's a much more realistic measure of basically what we're trying to do the best we can under these circumstances. But the idea that we can somehow create something that's perfect or great, we recognize that really is kind of grounded in a certain kind of grandiosity. So often, as we become more humble, we're less likely to actually be stymied by this idea of perfectionism, because we do the best we can in a situation, we work with the needs of the situation, and then we accept what we can't control, and we move on to the next thing we need to do.
You know, one of the other things when it comes to this unfinished and being, especially as a writer, is, I've read, again, you go back to some of your work from like 2004, we've been writing about this stuff for a while. You've been writing about this particularly for a long time. I've been writing about productivity for a while. Is that even when a book is done, it can evolve online afterwards, right? So it's not as if the work ever really ends, but it's the maybe the platform or the medium that you where it exists. That if you don't, again, there are lots of people who have a book in them, who have a film in them, anything creative, or even just they want to do something better, but there's that fear of not being able to do it right. Or you talk about this as well, the idea of saying, you know what, I'm only going to do these things that I like, and I'm going to avoid doing the things that I don't like. And in some cases, at least for me, that the things you don't like is maybe working on the thing you very well should be working on, right? Can you talk about that trap of the things that you only working on those things you like, and then avoiding the things that you don't like?
Sure, and I think that again, that sense of aversion has to do with fear or anxiety or just discomfort. I like going out to dinner, and I don't like washing dirty dishes. And so if I live my life on that basis, I'm going to spend a lot of money on restaurants, and I'm going to have a lot of dirty dishes in my sink. So at some point, if we want to essentially be more functional, but also more successful, more productive, we have to be able to make that shift. And I think part of that is really in recognizing that there are things that are important to do, and they're also often the things that we feel least comfortable doing, right? So who's writing a book, particularly their first or second book, may feel very anxious about it. And if it is your first or second book, you're not probably very good at it yet. And so you recognize that, and you really want to have a good book. And so the result can be you don't put the time into it, because it's easier to do things that are simple that you know how to do. You know how to drive to the cleaners to pick up your laundry. You know how to go to the supermarket and shop for food. Those things are easy, but those things aren't going to probably make a huge difference in the long term of your life, where getting your book out might make a huge difference. And it's also a way of creatively expressing yourself. And I'm a big cheerleader for the idea that each of us has something to creatively express. And in many cases, we're stopped by fear or anxiety or lack of confidence. And I think it's very important for us to really put our energy into that unique creative expression. It's what we can offer the world as unique individuals, as our contribution to the world while we're alive. So to me, whether it's poetry or writing or art or dance, if it's something that you feel is inside you, the important thing is to be able to get it out and express it and turn it into something real, even if it fails. You know, the writer Dostoevsky, the famous Russian writer, actually had 2 full suitcases worth of manuscripts that had never been published or accepted that he lost at a train station. So here's this person we consider one of the great classic writers in the history of the world, and yet he had all this writing that was never published and accepted. So this idea of our books evolving online, because of the system we have now, is both a blessing and a curse, in my opinion. In the past, we would write a book, and as a writer, you would be done with it and you'd move on to the next book. And now you can kind of continue editing forever, right? And just issuing updates online. But I do think it's extremely important that people accept the fact that fear and anxiety over things they're uncomfortable with is a very natural thing. But again, we don't want to let our feelings paralyze us or stop us. So in Morita therapy, we have this concept of taking your feelings with you, right? If you're going for a ride, you put your feelings in the back seat, you have them buckle their seatbelt, and you go where you need to go. You go to writing your book, or writing your play, or writing your poems and publishing them on your own. And you do those things feeling anxious and having no self-confidence at all. And you take those feelings and they just kind of come along with you on a leash, but you don't let them dictate your action or inaction.
Let's talk about this idea of it. When someone wants to explore these types of therapies or Japanese psychology, other than going to your institute and reading your work, like, is this something that's widely accessible throughout North America, or do people have to really do some digging, or like, where's a good jumping off point for people?
I would say that a good place to start is probably just reading. That's where I started. And there's a few books around. One of them is my book called The Art of Taking Action, Lessons from Japanese Psychology, and it gives you a kind of good overview and a lot of the principles that I've been talking about. There's a course that I teach once a year called The Art of Taking Action, and it's an unusual course because we actually have people select a project to work on. So you learn about taking action by actually taking action on something real in your life. But I think that some people can go very far with just, reading, and some people need someone to, coach them and work with them personally in order to learn this material. So it really varies with every person, but it isn't material that I think is kind of out there in the world in an easily accessible way. You do need to do a little digging, but if you do, you'll find this material either through our institute or through my writings or the writings of some of my colleagues. And I think it offers some very different views of things. For instance, we don't suggest that you try to motivate yourself or psych yourself up. So if you need to exercise and you feel really lethargic and lazy, what our recommendation is go ahead and notice that you're feeling lethargic. And while you're feeling lethargic and while you're feeling lazy and while you're having a little rehearsal in your mind, a little dialogue of, oh, I'll just exercise tomorrow and sit back down on the couch and see what's on Netflix. While you're having that go on, put on your running shoes and put on your shorts and put on your t-shirt and go outside the door, the whole time not feeling like it. And I do this often with swimming because for many years I didn't enjoy swimming, but I knew it was good for me. And so being in Vermont, I would get up in the morning and it would be 10 below zero outside, and I would go to a health club that had a pool, but I still had to go outside and start the car in that weather and shave off the ice from the windshield. And none of this I felt like doing. And often, even as I was about to get in the pool, I would think, I really don't feel like swimming. And then I would get in the pool and I would start swimming. And after maybe 3 or 4 or 5 laps, my feelings would shift. I would start feeling exhilarated. I could feel my muscles and my blood pumping. I might actually have a little bit of a sense of pride that I actually got in the pool and started exercising when I felt really tired that morning. So what we find is that instead of trying to get your mind to change, you allow your mind to be the way it is, and you put your body in the lead, right? So we have a maxim that's called lead with the body. Mm-hmm. So your body is in the lead. It takes the mind with you. And in many cases, though maybe not all cases, your mind, meaning your feelings and thoughts, actually will change after you've taken action. So here's this idea that you don't change your mind before you take action. Your mind is changed after you take action.
Gregg, this has been a great topic to discuss. I want to finish off with one final thing, and I want to talk about the idea of reflection. And you've got a book coming out. I want to talk about that idea of reflection because I think when I talk to people, I'm very, very clear on the fact that you need to you need to look back and review, and that's something a lot of people don't do. You've got a book coming out called Question Your Life. And I definitely want to dive a little bit into that before we wrap up, because I think it's something that often gets neglected. We get so caught in the doing and the moving forward that we don't take a moment to reflect and figure out, why are we doing this stuff in the first place, or are we doing the right things? Can you touch on that a little bit before we close things up?
Well, I think a big piece of it is that we can get very good at taking action. And there are some people who are just naturally good at that. I was never one of those people, but there are people who just naturally are very action-oriented people. The problem is that if that becomes the dominant or almost exclusive side of our personality, it becomes a situation where here's a person that gets a lot done and they don't care who they have to step on in order to do it. Right. Mm-hmm. In other words, we see someone who's very action oriented, but they're so focused on what they need to do that there's no consideration of other people's welfare, other people's feelings. So the relationships suffer. And so to me, an important part of self-reflection, which is actually should be a part of taking action, is reflecting on the impact that we're having on the world. And that's part of when I talk about self-reflection from a standpoint of Japanese psychology, that's a big element of it, is looking at what impact have I had on the world today. So we look at what I gave to the world today. We look at the troubles and difficulties that I caused. And it gives us a sense of how we've impacted on other people, on nature, on the planet. And it informs then our choice of actions that we need to take tomorrow. So my book, Question Your Life, really lays out a very specific and structured method for self-reflection, which can be done in conjunction with kind of a spiritual path, or in terms of relationships, like with trying to build your marriage or relationships with your family, or just in a very practical way in terms of looking at the underlying idea that I want to live my life in such a way that I make a contribution to the world. And to do that, I need to look sincerely at the impact I'm having, both good and bad, as far as the impact I'm having on the world. So if we can do that kind of reflection on a regular basis, I think it strengthens our ability not just to do things, to take action, but to take the kinds of actions that hopefully will really make the world a better place, improve our communities, improve our relationships with our loved ones, and ultimately give us something that's fulfilling and meaningful in our life.
Gregg, again, this has been great. I've not spent a lot of time in this realm, but I definitely have been gravitating more and more towards it, especially, the idea of Kaizen and just, learning to dive into this Eastern philosophies. Where, other than obviously at the website, which I'll list, can people find you on social media, or is there any place where they can connect with you personally?
Well, the best place probably would be, we have a Facebook page for the ToDo Institute, and then if they want to get my books, they can look on Amazon. The Art of Taking Action is actually one of the best sellers on Amazon in terms of the Zen category. But if they want to contact me directly, I'm happy to give out my email, and that's Gregg, Gregg, 2 G's at the end, the @ symbol, and then ToDo Institute, all one word, .org. So it's Gregg at ToDoInstitute.org.
Awesome. Gregg, thanks so much for joining me today on the Productivityist Podcast.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks to Gregg for joining me this week on the podcast. You can find all the things we talked about in the show notes, and you can find that over on the blog. Just go to the podcast category at the top of the website, and you'll find it in its most recent update. If you're listening to this the week it came out. If not, just do a search for Gregg Krech, and you will find it there. Also, we will have the weekly bonus episode featuring Gregg, where we talk about his idea of 30,000 days. And there's some interesting stuff there. If you are a supporter of the show, supporter of Productivityist, head over to patreon.com/productivityist to learn more about that. If you're not a member, and if you are, then you'll be able to get that podcast episode as a bonus episode shortly after this one has landed. Thanks to John Polstra for producing this show. Thanks to the rest of my team for helping me put the show together. And thanks to you for listening. Until next time, I am Mike Vardy of Productivityist, reminding you to stop guessing and start going.